Alright guys, we're going to take a look at the Gilded Age. We're going to only take a look at chapter 23 right now. I know that in terms of the notes I gave you all 3 chapters, but we're only going to take a look at what's in chapter 23. Again, I just decided to combine it so that you guys would have everything all at the same time. So one of the things that we have to begin to understand is that with the Republicans in power, and in power of an industrial North, one of the things that we will see is that essentially the winning economy is industrialization. And so the United States is going to move forward in a very industrial way. And so we will go from being the 4th largest economy prior to the Civil War to being the #1 economic power within a 40-year period. So the question is, how did that happen? There's lots of factors that determine that in terms of happening, and we'll address some of those in class. Now, for a lot of people, the argument is that it created a ton of prosperity. Well, one of the things that we'll eventually see is that this industrialization period will essentially facilitate an era of imperialism. And as a result of the imperialism, and because industrialization wasn't necessarily benefiting everybody, we're eventually going to see also an era called progressivism. Okay, and so those are gonna be our next 3 units, which is again the era of industrialization or the Gilded Age, the imperialistic unit, and then we're gonna take a look at the progressive unit. So one of the things that we'll see is that eventually social critics of what was happening begin to openly say things about it, and one of the people is going to be Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens, who is going to call this era the Gilded Age. And so gilded means that it is golden on the outside. And so his comment is going to be that the United States was golden on the outside, but it was actually rotting on the inside. So to the rest of the world, it looked like we were this golden oyster. So, like I said, it was a term coined by Mark Twain, referencing the superficial rise in the standard of living in the United States as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So the idea was that not everybody was really benefiting from it. So the U.S. was like an apple covered in gild, but rotting on the inside. So one of the very first things that we need to talk about, right, is who sort of starts off as president. So in 1868, General Ulysses S. Grant, we talked about this before, he ends up winning the presidency. He is the first of what is eventually going to be called the forgettable presidents, for many different reasons. One of the big reasons being that they mark an era of incredible corruption in the United States in terms of their relationship with big business. So like I said, Republicans nominated Ulysses S. Grant for the 1868 election. The Republicans wanted to remind the public of the bloodshed caused by the Democrats. And so we get this term called the waving of the bloody shirt. So the era following the Civil War saw an increase in political corruption. Like I was saying, it's nicknamed the era of good stealings. Essentially from 1868 to roughly 1900, you could say, is the era of good stealings. So corruption, we will see corruption at the local, state, and federal level. The first level of government that will eventually tackle the corruption will be the state government. And so we'll see how that is in terms of tackling it. But the pressure will come from the people, from local people. But again, we'll get to that later on. Unfortunately, a lot of the corruption that begins during this period is going to be tied to President Grant because it happens right underneath his nose, and so his administration. One of the very first things that happened was these 2 guys right here. These 2, essentially, they were like businessmen / bankers / stockbrokers. These 2 partners, Jim Fisk and Jay Gould, they had this idea that they wanted to corner the gold market. And what I mean by the gold market was they wanted to try to hoard as much gold because the government was going to pay back the gold at face value, the greenbacks at face value. And so I'll explain this in class a little bit more in terms of what is meant. But they were trying to corner the gold market so that they can make more money. They were relying very much so on trying to ensure that the Treasury would not release the gold that they had. And the reason they wanted that is because the price of gold would go up. And one of the people that they were hoping to get on their side was President Grant's brother-in-law, who had a connection to the Treasury. And so they essentially were using President Grant's brother-in-law supposedly without President Grant actually knowing. The scheme eventually does fail, because the Treasury will release the gold. But again, in terms of a federal level, it makes President Grant look bad. One of the things at the local level that we will see is we will see the rise of what is called political machines. So political machines are essentially like these, they're not even political institutions, if you may, but they are more of like an organization that is created at the local level to sort of run a lot of the back end stuff for the local governments. And so they will create a lot of power, these political machines. They're almost like a gang, a political gang that is sort of started. And the most famous one is actually in New York City. It's called Tammany Hall. And it is run by probably one of the most famous political machine bosses, a guy by the name of Boss Tweed. He eventually is busted, and he is busted for cheating the city of New York out of $200 million. One of the people that is heavily responsible, and you can see one of his cartoons here, but one of the people that is heavily responsible is the famous cartoonist Thomas Nast that I've talked to you guys about before. And so because of his cartoons, it put pressure on the state of New York to actually get a special prosecutor. And the special prosecutor is going to be by a guy by the name of Samuel J. Tilden. And he is the one that's going to put Boss Tweed away. Samuel Tilden, because he's able to do this, he's going to gain fame as this like great reformer. And eventually in 1876, he is going to be nominated for the presidency under the Democratic banner because he is someone who attacks corruption. One of the most famous federal level corruption things that happened under the Grant administration also is the credit mobiler scandal. And so one of the things that happened was the federal government had actually ratified the building of the first transcontinental railroad. So coming from Sacramento to the east was the Central Pacific Railroad, but from Omaha, Nebraska to the west was the Union Pacific Railroad. And so the Union Pacific Railroad, one of the things that the way that it would work is that the railroad companies were not to build the actual, they were the railroad business. And so one of the things, because they were receiving federal grants, federal money, is that the railroads were supposed to hire out, they were supposed to sort of create a bidding process to hire out a construction company to build the railroad. Well, what the Union Pacific Railroad did is they actually created their own construction company, and they called it the Credit Mobiler Company. And so by doing that, they would essentially be taking money out of their right pocket that the government was giving them and put it into their left pocket, right? So they weren't going to lose any money. Now, if another company, right, actually bid for it, then that company would actually get the money. But one of the ways that the Credit Mobiler Company, or in this case the Union Pacific Railroad, one of the ways that they ensured that this was going to happen was that they were actually giving what are called kickbacks to congressmen. So they were actually giving congressmen stock in the Credit Mobiler Company, and in the Union Pacific. And so if both companies did well, these congressmen were going to do well. So members of Congress had received stock, right, in order to keep quiet. And they eventually a lot of these men get in trouble. They get busted. And one of the people that also gets in trouble is the vice president, because he was also in on this scam. And then we have the whiskey ring. So in 1875, the public learned about what is called the whiskey ring scandal. So what was happening was people were avoiding paying these excise taxes. And so they were robbing Congress of millions of dollars. Grant's own personal secretary was involved in the whiskey scam. So again, a lot of this stuff happening under the Grant administration, right? Because the idea was that there was so much money to be made out there, even if it meant illegally. So one of the things that we'll eventually see is that because of the corruption that was emerging within the 4 years of Grant's administration, is that in 1872, some of the Republicans actually became what are called liberal Republicans. Like they were growing tired of some of the corruption. And so they organized their own party, and they nominated this guy, Horace Greeley. The Democrats liked them too because they saw him as a symbol of anti-corruption, and they were hoping that if they got somebody into the presidency, that would have a little bit of sentiment towards the Democrats and anti-corruption, that the Democrats could get their foot back in the door also. So there was a lot of mudslinging during this campaign, like we see with a lot of them. one of the things that Greeley was accused of was being an atheist, a communist, a vegetarian, right? How un-American. And he's also one of the people that signed off on Jefferson Davis's bail bond bill. Grant was called ignoramus. He was called a drunkard and a swindler. And Grant still won the election in 1872. So he becomes president for the second time. So immediately following Grant's inauguration, the country fell into a panic. It's called the Panic of 1873. Why? Because of overspeculation. In this case, the overspeculation was railroad and factory production. So there were too many railroads competing, and as a result, money was being lost. And because of industrialization, too many companies were opening up, too many factories, and so there was overproduction and surplus, and so many of these had to close down. So the banks had overspeculated on the loans, right, to the railroad companies and also to these corporations or these factories. Now, what happens is because there was a recession, one of the things that was argued by people who had all these debts is they began arguing for inflation. So they said, you know what, one of the things that we should do is we should put more money into the economy, right? How many times have you ever thought about that, right? Well, if we don't have enough money, why don't we print more, right? Well, if we print more, it actually devalues the money. So here's the thing. If you are the people who have lent the money out, you don't want more money to be put into the economy, because what that does is it devalues. So even though you're going to get paid back the money, it devalues the worth of what you're getting paid back. So the people that don't want to see more money put into the economy, they are called hard money advocates. And those that want more money, they're called soft money advocates because they want inflation. The argument from the hard money people was, look, well, the standard was gold, and so we can't put more because there's X amount of gold, and so if we put in more money, it devalues that money because you can't exchange it for the same amount of gold. So one of the things that the soft money advocates began arguing is, well, if that's the case and we back our money based on gold, then one of the things that we should try to do is maybe introduce silver into the equation. Well, so a lot of what was happening, like I said, began to create massive divisions within the Republican Party. One of the things that we see is these nicknames emerge. One is the stalwarts. So the stalwart Republicans are the Republicans that have been there for a long time. Their sort of symbolic leader is a guy by the name of Roscoe Conkling. And then the Republicans who were newer, who were anti-corruption, who maybe wanted to get their foot in the door, but were not willing to play the patronage game and not necessarily play the politics game. They were called half-breeds, in other words, half-hearted, like they weren't true Republicans. And then this picture you see sort of their leader, a guy by the name of James G. Blaine. So the election of 1876, the Democrats nominated, like I had told you guys, Samuel Tilden. The Republicans nominated a guy by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes. Tilden actually got 184 out of the 185 electoral votes that were needed to win. But there was a problem because Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, and Oregon had disputed election counts. And so the federal government didn't know how to deal, the 4 states didn't know how to deal with their elections. And so there was questionable returns on all 4 of those states. As a result, one of the things that Congress did was they created the Electoral Count Act of 1877. So it set up an electoral commission consisting of 15 men, 7 from the Senate, 7 from the House, and 1 independent member of the Supreme Court. And what ended up happening was that person resigned from the position, and so they ended up getting, 7, not 7 from the House and 7 from the Senate, but 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats, and there was supposed to be an independent. And so that person resigned from the position, and so they ended up picking 1 more Republican. And so now you had 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. Well, you do the math, it's 8-7. So what resulted was what is called the Compromise of 1877. So Rutherford B. Hayes became president, and one of the things that the Democrats got in return was the end of military reconstruction in 1877. So one of the things that I want to bring up in class was who were the winners and who were the losers. So I want you to think about that when you're listening to this. Who are the winners and who are the losers of the Compromise of 1877? So one of the results of the Compromise of 1877, since there's no occupying military, and so there's nobody to keep an eye on what the Southern redeeming governments are doing, we see the birth of the Jim Crow South. So the end of military Reconstruction, so the assertion of power by the Redeemer governments, right? So they began passing legislation in these states, keeping African Americans from having power. So things like literacy exam for voting, poll taxes, and then also they began creating separate facilities for African Americans so that they wouldn't be in the same facilities with whites. Eventually, this will culminate in a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was actually legal, and so thus they were supporting the claim that segregation was constitutional. So one of the things we also begin to see, especially in the North, is we began to see as more and more cultures began to emerge in these known cities, we began to see clashes between race, ethnicities, Irish, Chinese, blacks, whoever it may be, and the corporate leaders, the leaders and owners of these factories, they loved it, right? Because they could play one against the other. This whole relationship in terms of ethnic and cultural lines and racial lines was tested in 1877. So in 1877, the four largest railroad companies, they decided that they were going to together cut back on, they wanted to make more profit. And so one of the things that they did was they decided that they were going to cut back on the wages for their employees. And so there was a massive railroad strike. And what ended up happening was federal troops were called in to calm down the strike, and over 100 people were killed. And so the failure of this giant railroad strike, right, hit at the point of that even though labor was all in the same boat, right, they couldn't be strong in terms of their dispute and their protesting because they were more worried about the differences in terms of race and ethnicity and those things than they were in terms of equal opportunity for themselves and getting higher wages. So again, one of the things that we'll see, right, is like friction between like the Chinese and the Irish, for example. So this is a great example. In San Francisco, we begin to see this. So there was an Irish-born guy by the name of Dennis Kearney in San Francisco, and he began rallying people in San Francisco to be anti-Chinese, right? Why? Because the Irish and the Chinese were competing, right, in terms of labor. And so because of the pressure from what was happening, eventually in 1882, Congress ratified the Chinese Exclusion Act, which essentially barred Chinese from entering the U.S. It was the first anti-immigration law that started in the United States. Then the election of 1880, the Republicans nominated James Garfield. The Chester Arthur was his running mate, who was a stalwart Republican. It was understood that James Garfield was also a stalwart. The Democrats nominated Civil War General Winfield Scott. He was one of the generals of the 5 districts in the South, and he tended to be soft on them, and so they liked him. And Garfield won the election 214 electoral votes to 155. And one of the things that he immediately did was he decided that he was not going to play the patronage game. And so he was not down with the whole spoilsman thing. And so he wanted to kind of bridge the aisle between the stalwarts and the half-breeds. And so Garfield named James G. Blaine, the leader of the half-breeds, to be the Secretary of State. And this upset many stalwarts who were job seekers. And there was a man by the name of Charles Gautier, who was a stalwart, and he was hoping that he would get a job in the administration of Garfield. And since he did not get a job, and a half-breed did, and the half-breeds weren't loyal to the stalwarts, he took it upon himself on September 19th, 1881, to assassinate Garfield. And one of the things he said is, "Garfield is dead. Garfield is dead. Chester is president, or Arthur is president." And so what happened was they believed solely that Chester Arthur would come in and there would spawn a new era of patronage. Well, if you're Arthur, you're thinking to yourself, well, there was this whole patronage thing that got Garfield killed in the first place. So, you know what, why not take this patronage thing out of the hands of the president? And so he began to push for civil reform. So civil meaning, civil employees, as in like anybody who works for the government. And so Congress eventually ratified the 1883 Pendleton Civil Service Act, which is nicknamed the Magna Carta of Civil Service. So it set up the Civil Service Commission. And the idea was people who were going to get government jobs, they had to be qualified. And so one of the things they had to do was pass an examination. So for example, for myself as a teacher, I am a government employee. I had to pass several examinations, several hoops. And so it was the job of the Civil Service Commission, right, to ensure that this was happening. So the Pendleton Civil Service Act, though, and we'll talk more about this in class, and one of the quotes about it is that it divorced patronage from politics, but it set up a marriage of convenience between big business and politics. And I want you to really think about what that quote means, because we're going to talk about it in class tomorrow. The election of 1884, the Republicans nominated James G. Blaine. The Democrats nominated Grover Cleveland. And one of the things that we saw was that there is going to be what we call mugwumps. And so it's a Native American term for someone who flops sides or flip-flops. So there were Republicans that became upset with the party of the Republican Party, and they switched over to the Democrats. And so as a result, Grover Cleveland will be the president in 1884. He is the first Democrat since James Buchanan. He claimed to be supportive of big business because he supported laissez-faire. He said he would not get involved in the affair of business. And so one of the things that created sort of a problem was under him was that several millions of dollars of Civil War pension money was misused under the Cleveland administration. But one of the things that's very important to understand, too, is that when he took over as president, there was actually a surplus in the Treasury, $145 million in terms of surplus. Well, even though he was pro-business and he was laissez-faire, because there was a surplus, he is a Democrat still, and one of the things that he began to advocate for was the idea that maybe since there was a surplus and there was money, there was a chance of maybe lowering the tariff. So he began to talk about lowering the tariff, and this made Democrats, his party, very upset. And the reason it made them very upset is because he was giving himself a black eye by talking about the tariff and talking about lowering it, because the Republicans don't want to lower the tariff. And so the Republicans would have ammunition against Cleveland to get him ousted as president. And so the Republicans were upset at him, right? Or upset, but also at the same time happy because they had the ammunition, but the Democrats are heavily upset. And so it was kind of considered political suicide. So in 1887, Cleveland appealed to lower the tariff. So the Democrats were upset at Cleveland. They were trying to bring up the tariff. So the Republicans were determined to crush the tariff in Cleveland. And so in the election of 1888, Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison, became president. Not much, and then Cleveland is reelected in 1893. But then following the election of 1893, there's going to be a panic. And so one of the things, again, because of over-speculation, and again, because of over-speculation and because there was a panic, similar to the panic of 1873, there is going to come up again the silver and gold issue and the issue of hard and soft money. So eventually, we'll talk about when we get to the progressive movement, the populist movement, we'll talk about the Wizard of Oz. So Cleveland, because of the recession, because of how bad of the recession was, he's actually going to be forced to go to J.P. Morgan, who is one of the main businessmen during this time, one of the captains of industry. And so he made a lot of his money in the railroad and banking industry, eventually in steel industry. He is going to actually give the United States government a loan, okay, and he's going to bail us out.